Hello again, and welcome back to the course Life of Christ. We're in the middle of class 22, where we're beginning to look at some of the parables of Jesus. And in the first part of this class, we looked at the parable of the lost sheep and of the lost coin. And we see that Jesus offered these stories as a response to the Pharisees who are accusing him of eating with sinners, welcoming sinners. And Jesus says, look, this is how God feels when lost sheep or lost people come back to him. There's rejoicing in heaven because that's what the heart of the Father is like. So let's go on to the third story in this chapter that talks about the prodigal son. And as we look through this story in verses 11 through 24, I want you to try to think about the perspective of these different people in the story, what the son's thoughts and feelings would have been like as he went through this, how the father thought and felt, and the older brother, and then even the villagers as they watched this story taking place in front of them, and try to get inside the heads and the hearts of these people. Verse 11, Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate." Great story. All right, now let's look at again the structure, the literary structure of this story. Again, we saw that in the first 2 parables, Luke used what we call a chiastic structure to point out what was the key element of the story, what was the core of the story. And once again, we see that even more so, there's great parallelism as Luke writes this story. Again, the first line here, a son is lost, and A down here, a son is found. And B, there's wasted possessions. And B, there's goods used for celebrations, which some think is a good use, but the older brother thought was probably a waste. C, everything is lost. Parallel, everything is recovered and restored. There's a great sin, and there's a great repentance in D. There's complete rejection at the first, and there's a total acceptance at the end by the Father. And then in the heart of the story, what's the key point of the story for Luke? It's this change of mind that the younger brother has, and the beginning of repentance, the restoration of this son who was lost and had run away from his family. Now he's come back. And so the celebration is the change in the young man. And so there's a party, again, in the middle of this story. Does this sound familiar yet? From the first 3 parables. Now, I want to understand a little bit more about the cultural background, because this is where we can really delve a great more into the background and to the meaning of this. Among the Jews and the Arabs, there's no law of inheritance that permits a son to inherit while the father still lives. It's just not done. It's not even talked about in the majority of cases until the father dies. And so even if the will is written and the son or sons know about how the father is going to distribute his wealth after he dies, still by law the son can't spend anything of his father's inheritance, can't sell anything until the father dies. It's just not done. It's not legal, and it's not culturally appropriate. And so when the son comes up here and he says to the father, give me my share of the inheritance, it's as if he's saying to the father, I wish you were dead already. Probably the same impact if we went to our parents and said, are you going to give me my stuff now? Aren't you dead yet? It's just a tremendous slap in the face. And in that culture, if a son had done that, then there would have been complete rejection of that son and punishment for the son for the lack of respect he's showing to the father, and for the lack of respect the father then faces in the rest of the village for having a son who acts like this. And so this is just a terrible insult, and sometimes we pass over how awful what this son does is in this situation. Now, you kind of wonder, what's the prodigal son thinking? He's asked his father, and the surprising thing is the father accepts. He doesn't reject the son. He doesn't punish the son. He doesn't throw the son out. He gives the son what belongs to him in his inheritance. It's just amazing. No father would do this, but this father must realize, I've lost this son temporarily anyway. And so he gives in, hoping perhaps that this will teach the son a lesson. So the son gets his stuff. But it's not as if in those days you could go down to the bank and say, okay, of the $100,000 in the account, $50,000 is mine. That's not the way it would have worked. Probably most of the wealth that this father had that he was going to pass on to his son was in the form of property, animals, livestock of different kinds, sheep, goats, camels, whatever. Perhaps, part of the house, part of the furniture, goods if the father's a merchant. And so in order for the son to benefit from this and to be able to carry his wealth into the far country, then most likely he has to take everything that his father is giving him and has to sell it. He has to convert it into money that he can carry away to another country. And we don't know exactly how he went about that, because he only has two options. He can sell to the Jews that are in the village, and that would have been a great disgrace, because if the people didn't already know what was happening in this home, then they would know, and they'd be asking, why are you doing this? Your father's not dead yet. He gave you this stuff, but did you ask him for this? And when they find out, it would have been a complete lack of respect for the father and a great disgrace for the father and for the son who had acted this way. But even so, some of the Jews in the village might have bought the stuff, especially if the son just wanted to convert it to cash and gave him really bargain prices on it. And so if that's the case, then not only did he waste part of his father's wealth, but also the Jews that bought were complicit in helping the son disrespect his father. Now, if the Jews didn't buy it, suppose all the Jews in the village said, we're not going to be part of showing this disrespect to your father, and so you need to find other buyers. Well, then he could have gone to the Gentiles that lived in the village. There may not have been many, but we know that there were a number of Gentiles mixed in Galilee with the population. And for a Jew to give or lose property to a Gentile was also a great disgrace. And for a Jew to choose to sell his property to a Gentile was unthinkable. And so if the other Jews in the village didn't buy the stuff, the Gentiles had to. And so that also would have brought great disgrace on the son and on the family, on the father especially. And so basically what we're seeing is here, by the time he gets the materials that he needs converted to wealth, then he has lost the favor with his entire village. He's burned all the bridges that he had. He's disgraced his family completely. And so even if he wasn't planning on leaving town now, he couldn't stay around because he's in such great disgrace, and everyone would turn away from him. Now, back in those days, when a person had disgraced himself or committed a great crime that brought disrespect and dishonor to the village, then sometimes they would have a ceremony called the Kesasa ceremony, Qesasah, Kesasa. And the community and the family would gather around the person that was being thrown out, and they would take a jar and they would break it. And they would say, we're breaking the relationship that we have with this person because of the actions they've taken. And then if somehow the person repented and came back and got the inheritance back, then they would say he has returned to his inheritance. And then sometimes they would receive him back. But often once the Kesasa ceremony took place, the person was forever excluded from the village. And that could have been one of the things that happened to the prodigal before he leaves town. But evidently he doesn't care that much about it. And so you think about him leaving and he goes off to a far country. We don't know how far. If he was in Galilee, perhaps he went around the Sea of Galilee or crossed the sea and went to the Decapolis on the other side, where they do have Gentiles and where they do have pigs. We know that that would have been a place that the Jews would have considered a far country and a sinful country as well. And so we're not sure, but that's a likely possibility for Galilee. Now, the other person that we haven't really heard anything about in the first part of the story is the older son. And you think, where is the older son in all of this story? Because normally, the older son should have protested what his brother did to the father, the lack of honor he's showing his father. The older son should have tried to be a mediator and solve the problem between the father and the son, but he doesn't do either one. In fact, he's invisible in the first part of the story pretty much. And so that also seems to speak about the kind of relationship he had or didn't have with his father and with his younger brother. And it explains maybe a little bit more his attitude later on in the story. And so the son goes off, and it says he spends all of his money, squanders his wealth, and we don't know at what. The older son later thinks that it's with prostitutes and people of ill repute. I don't know for sure, but it says he squanders it. And it says he ends up desperate. And it says that the verb in Greek is he sticks himself to a citizen of the distant country. In other words, he hires himself out, makes himself an abject servant of that person, and ends up feeding pigs. You think about where this young man has come from a respected family, with a position in the community, with an inheritance waiting for him, a proud member of the synagogue, following the Jewish law, and now he's lost all of that. He's lost his family, his community, his money, his friends, if he had any, his self-respect, and even his religion, because he shouldn't even be anywhere near pigs, much less feeding them and even wanting to eat what they ate. Now, to stop here, just another cultural point. You have a question about why was the prodigal hungry? And they've done some research on this, and they've told this story in different cultures and countries around the world. And one of the things that they found is that the reason given for the hunger of the prodigal varies from country to country depending on what's happened in that country. So, for example, if you go to a place like the United States and you tell this story and you say, why was the young man hungry? People in the States will say, well, he spent everything. He was irresponsible and he brought this on himself, okay, which is actually true. And then in other countries, I think they went to Russia and they said, why is this young man hungry? And the Russians said, well, there is a severe famine. And so that's why he was hungry, because Russia knows famines in their history. And so they didn't necessarily blame the young man. They saw him maybe as a victim of what happened in the country. And then they go to another country, I think it was like Tunisia or something, and it said, why was the young man hungry? And they said, well, because no one gave him anything, which is also part of the story. And the idea of community. In a community, you take care of your own people, and no one goes hungry if you can be avoided at all. That's interesting, isn't it? That they have three different versions, and maybe there's more reactions than this, but all those reasons are in the story as well. But depending on where you're from, you kind of tend to focus on one more than the other. And so finally, you have the young man coming to his senses, okay? And he starts to think about going home. He's not completely repentant yet, but he's starting to think, well, maybe I made some mistakes. And even back at home, it's not going to be as bad as it is here. And whatever it was that drove him out from the village in the first place, he's thinking it's not as bad as what he's experiencing now. And so perhaps this is an example of maybe God helping this guy hit rock bottom. If you notice in the first parable that we read of the sheep, that's a living being, but really not too smart. The coin is not even a living being, it just gets lost. But in this case, one of the reasons I think the father lets the son go instead of going after him is because at some moments you can't tell people what to do. You can't force them to do what you know they should do and what they know they should do. You have sometimes to let people go and hit rock bottom, and then perhaps they'll listen to the Lord and other people. And so he starts to think about what it's going to be like to go back home. And you think about how the village is going to react to him, how his father and older brother are going to react to him, what his life is going to be like, what's he going to work at, is he even going to be let back into the house? But he's thinking, it looks like, that maybe he'll end up as a hired man. And for him, that doesn't sound too bad. It's not as good as being the son of maybe a rich merchant. But a hired man was a free man back in that culture. He lived in his own house. He had his own income. And so this, in a certain way, would let the prodigal retain his independence and his self-esteem. And so it's not as bad necessarily as going back and then having to depend on his older brother, because now everything belonged to his older brother after his father passes away. And maybe if he earns enough money, somehow he can pay his father and his family back and get his inheritance back. Again, he wouldn't be dependent on his older brother when his father passed away. All right, so he goes home, and it says while he's still a long way off, the father sees him, which shows you the father never gave up seeing his son coming back. And so we don't know where he was in the village. We don't know what were the road or anything, but it says the father was watching and waiting for him, which I love it. And so it says he runs, which is not dignified at all in that culture for an older man. He runs and he meets his son. And you wonder why he does it. Obviously because he loves him. But perhaps the father's also thinking about, if my son ever comes home, then how are the villagers going to react to him? And he knows that in that culture, if he can go out and set the tone with his son, then the rest of the village will take his cue from how he treats his own son. And so that's perhaps why he ran, because he wanted to be the first one to meet his son. He didn't want anyone to have the chance to insult his son or to throw rocks at his son or to throw his son out of the village. And so he runs and he gets to his son first, and he begins to set the tone for how he wants the rest of the village to treat his son, and also to let the rest of the village know how he feels about his son as well. Just an amazing story. Now, let me pause again, and that is to say that for the Pharisees, they're listening to this parable. As I understand it, they also had this story, this parable, and it was the same all the way up to this point. They had the father and the two sons and the prodigal, and he went off and he wasted his money, repented, came home, and he meets his father in the middle of the village. And in the Pharisees' version of the story, then the father said, "You're no son of mine," and he rips his clothes in a sign of mourning, and he turns his son away, and he says, "You have no inheritance in this village, go away." And there's a certain kind of justice to that, and it may be fair, but it's not the story Jesus wanted to communicate. And so maybe the Pharisees are going along and thinking, okay, so we're tracking with this story. We know the end of this story, and all of a sudden Jesus rips that ending away and replaces it with an ending of how the true Father in heaven would react if a lost sinner comes home. I love that. Jesus does that often in his parables, a surprise ending. So he runs to his son. He kisses him. Let me catch up here. Okay. All right. So he runs to his son. He kisses him, it says. He says, "Kill the fatted calf and let's have a celebration." He puts sandals on him. He gives him the ring. And all of these things are signs that not only does the father accept his son back, but he gives him authority back. He gives him some rights back. The sandals show he's still a free man, not a hired man. In other words, he restores his son completely, and then he invites the village to the party. That's just an amazing thing that we see here. All right, and so evidently the son decides to accept what the father has told him, and he decides to accept the forgiveness. He doesn't even finish his speech. He just decides to say, okay, if the father loves me this much, I'm going to go back and I'm going to take advantage in a good way of the father's love and concern. And so everything that he might have had to do, and putting up with his older brother and maybe not having any more inheritance, he decides to accept that because of the welcome the father gives him. Now, I know that some people may read this first part of the story and think, yeah, but doesn't this son get off a little too easy? Is that really the case when people go away and they mess up completely and they show all kinds of disrespect and they destroy families and bring shame on themselves and the community? Man, shouldn't there be some kind of payoff? Shouldn't there be some punishment? And I'm not saying that there was never punishment. You know that when this son walked around the village in the days and weeks to come, you know that wasn't easy. You know that people probably treated him pretty coldly, even though they were probably civil for the sake of the father. And I think personally that after the party was over that night, or maybe the next morning, that the father came and sat down with the son, and they probably had a long talk about, son, what was it about the life here that made you run before? Why did you treat me the way you treated me? That really stung, and it hurt me in the village. Let me tell you how sad I was all the nights you were away thinking you might not even be alive. I might have lost you forever. And let me tell you what life is going to be like from now on here, because I expect you to have certain responsibilities. I can imagine all of those conversations between the father and the prodigal, because I'm a son and I'm a father. And if this kind of thing had happened, I'm sure those conversations would have taken place. And so we know that when people sin and hurt others, there are consequences. And yet what Jesus focuses on in this story is the heart of the Father, once again. And so in these first three parables that we've seen so far in this chapter 15 of Luke, the reaction that's at the core of every story is joy, joy, joy. And this is an answer to the Pharisees who are there. Now let's go on to the next part of the story. And again, I want you, as we read this, to put yourselves in the shoes of the same people, son, father, older brother, and villagers. It's a little bit shorter and not quite as happy. Verse 25. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. Your brother has come, he replied, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound. The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you killed a fattened calf for him. My son, the father said, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. Now, if we look again at this story structure, it's the same kind of parallel structure with the same kind of pointing toward the core. But this is different. You have here, he comes to the house, and the parallel line, there's not a parallel line. We're going to come back to that later. B, your brother has arrived. Let's party. Your brother has arrived. Come on to the party. C, the father goes out to reconcile to him. And again, the father tries to reconcile to him twice. The father goes out to the son. So it's not as if the father treated the younger son with love and the older son brusquely. The father treats both sons the same. He loves both sons. He shares possessions with both sons. When they mess up, he goes out to both sons. He tries to reconcile with both sons. He invites both sons to a party. It's not as if the father acted differently. So we see, again, the parallel nature here. But look at what's at the core of this story here. There's two complaints. One, how you've treated me, and I've been faithful. And two, how you've treated him. He hasn't been, and look what you're doing for him. And so this core of this story is a huge contrast to the core of the first three stories, because now we have joy, 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 complaint. And this sounds a lot like the Pharisees at the beginning of the chapter. They were complaining, griping about how Jesus was treating these sinners that had come back home. And you hope the Pharisees saw themselves. You know they probably did. Okay? And so the older son reacts in this story with suspicion and questions the servants, maybe asking them about the circumstances of his return. He decides not to go into the house at first, which normally would be his role. He's supposed to go into the house and help his father be a host to the party. He's supposed to serve other people at the party. He's supposed to welcome the guest and hug his brother and show that he too welcomes his younger brother back into the house, participate in the joy. But he doesn't do that. And so when he refuses to go in, he also humiliates his father in such a way that it's almost the same kind of insults to the father that the younger son gave at the beginning of the story. And he says also he never disobeyed him, never disobeyed his father, but he's just finished insulting him in public. And before, we don't see he did anything to repair the breach between the father and the younger son. In some ways, we see that even though the prodigal son rebelled and left home, it almost seems like the older son rebelled in his heart while staying at home, because that's what we see. And when he refuses the relationship with his brother, he's also refusing the relationship with his father, right? Remember in 1 John it says, if you don't love your brother whom you can see, how can you love your father whom you can't see? If we reject each other as brothers and sisters, then God takes that personally as a father as well. And so in some ways, he's almost taken himself out of the family, almost as if he's broken the jar in the Kesasa ceremony and taken himself out. Okay? Now, again, how should the father react to this older son? In this culture, when a son rebels in this way and humiliates the father and doesn't do what he's supposed to, insults his father, the father also has the right to throw him out. So again, the father could have done the same thing with both sons, but he chooses not to both times. But again, he goes out with love. He humbles himself instead of humiliating his older son. And he hopes that going out to his older son with love and acceptance will result in the same kind of reaction, but it doesn't. He doesn't get any respect from his older son still. Instead, there's a double complaint, and he really has more the attitude of a slave instead of a son. He almost wants the salary and not the relationship with his father. So with this, the father has the right to demand that now this son leave home, but he doesn't want to lose a son. And he doesn't want a slave for a son, so he ignores the insults and lets the son stay. In fact, he invites the son again into the home. We have to rejoice. Don't you want to come be with us? And so we see that the joy, which is present in the first three stories, is absent in this story. Okay? Now, this chapter begins with the complaint about Jesus eating with sinners. And then Jesus tells these stories. And then it ends, the last thing which the father says is, we had to celebrate and be glad because this son of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. Okay? And so the invitation is still there. And it's as if Jesus is telling the story, and then he gets to this last line. He said, but we have to celebrate and be glad because these lost people have been found. It's a direct invitation to the Pharisees to respond the same way God responds to sinners. Now, the interesting thing about this structure of the story, the way Luke writes it, is you remember the last line that should have been parallel to the first line. Go back to that real quickly here. Right here. It should have been the older son comes to the house and joins in the celebration and in the party. Okay? That should be the parallel down here. And Luke 15 ends, and we don't have any of that. Okay? We don't know what the Pharisees did. We suspect they may have grumbled and turned away like they did at other times. We hope that they learned, and maybe some of them, maybe a Nicodemus or a Gamaliel or other scribes or teachers that later converted in Acts, maybe this was a turning point for them. And they said, you're right. That is how God responds to sinners. That's what I want God to do with me if I'm a sinner. And so you hope that some of them nodded and said to Jesus, you're right, and then began to welcome the other sinners Jesus is with. We hope. But also, Luke writes this, and Luke structures it in such a way where Luke also leaves the reader hanging. You know, Jesus already told his story and left his audience hanging with the invitation. Luke does the same thing. We read this story, and we don't know what happened. Did the older brother go in or not? Did the Pharisees respond well or not? And then in our lives, are we going to respond or not? How do we treat sinners who repent? Okay? Again, that's the hanging question at the end of this story. Now, I want to tell you a story about a guy named Tony Campolo. Some of you may know him. He's a well-known evangelical preacher. And the story goes that Tony went to visit in a bar when he was in a far country. He had gone to do a conference, and it was so far away that the time schedule was way different. He was like 8 hours difference, and his body wasn't used to the jet lag yet. And so he finishes his conference at night, but he can't sleep. And about 3 in the morning, he decides he wants some coffee. And so he goes out, and the only place he can find in the neighborhood to get coffee at 3 in the morning is at a bar. And so he walks into the bar and sits down at the bar and orders some coffee. And he starts talking to the bar man and his wife who are there. And a few minutes later, the door opens again, and a group of women come in. And they sit down and they, get something to drink. And he's kind of listening to their conversation without really eavesdropping. And he realizes that this is a group of prostitutes who have come in, and they're kind of on their middle of the night break. And, they've just finished being with some customers, and they're going to go back with more customers. And so they finish and they go out. So Tony looks at the barman and his wife, and he says, "Does that group of women come in here every night?" And the guy says, "Yeah, they mostly do." And Tony says, "One of those ladies, I think I want to call her Helen or somebody like that. Helen said that tomorrow is her birthday. What would it be like if tomorrow night at 3, I came back again, and when they come in, we have a birthday party ready for Helen?" And the barman and his wife kind of look at Tony like he's absolutely crazy. But they kind of warm up to the idea. And Tony says, "Look, I'll go buy her a present." And the wife says, "Well, I'll bake her a cake." And the barman says, "Okay, well, I'll put up a banner that says, 'Happy Birthday, Helen.'" And so sure enough, they do that. And next night at 3 in the morning, they're all there at the bar. And sure enough, the same group of ladies comes in, and Helen's with them. And she walks in and she sees the banner with "Happy Birthday, Helen." And then they say, "Happy birthday," and they sing to her, and they bring out the cake and they put it on the table, and everybody is clapping. Tony puts his whole present down on the table and gives it to her, and Helen doesn't know what to say. She's dumbfounded. And they go to cut the cake, and Helen says, Don't do that." And they're like, "Why?" She says, "Because this is the first time in my life that anybody's ever made a cake for my birthday, and I want to take home and look at it and enjoy it." And so they understood. And so they finished the party, and they finished drinks and all that, and they go back out. And so the barman and his wife look over at Tony again, and they're still not quite sure, where all this comes from. And the guy says, "Who are you anyway?" to Tony. And Tony says, "Well, I'm a pastor of a church." And they said, "What church is that?" And Tony says, in a moment of inspiration, he said, "Well, I'm pastor of a church that gives birthday parties for prostitutes at 3 in the morning." And the barman kind of laughed, but then looked at him and said, "Well, there's no church like that around here, because if there were, I'd go to that church." And you kind of wonder, if you were in that bar and you knew about that party, would you show up and help give a birthday party for that lady? And I think Jesus of Luke 15 would go to that party. And I think he'd bring her a present and the cake and celebrate with her. If you look at this story, this whole chapter, you think, who am I most like in that story? You like to think that you're like the Father, right? Because we all want to be the good guy. And we probably are. We probably are the Father sometimes. But I think also we're probably the prodigal son sometimes and run away from God. We're probably the older brother who don't run away but still criticize everybody else and have rebellion in our hearts. And we're probably also like the villagers that watch and criticize, and the Pharisees who watch and criticize. We're probably like all of the people in the story. And the idea is we want to be most like God. And that's hard to do. But that's the invitation from Jesus in this story. What are you going to be like? And what are you going to do with when lost people come back around? Hope this has been helpful to you as far as the parables and understanding God's heart. God bless you. We'll see you next class.